Welcome everybody to another evening with the Echo Hawk family on Zoom. In the last month or so, we've heard from several family members, their discussions about their lives, and several family members who were students in the special scholarship program in law at the University of New Mexico. And when that program got launched in the late 60s, and they were students in the late 60s and early 70s, there were only a few Indians who were attorneys at that point in time. And so they went on through that program, and it launched a major change in Indian country, having a number of Indian lawyers. I think after about 10 years or so, there were several hundred Indians who were attorneys in Indian country. Made a huge difference. And we heard the stories of several of our family members who took part and helped shape those days. When I got into my senior year in high school in 1971, the Ford Foundation did a survey of Indians with advanced degrees, and they could only identify 17 people nationwide who had advanced degrees of one kind or another. Don't know if that was accurate or not, but the entrance from law schools of Indian attorneys into Indian country made a big difference. Now, about 12 years ago or so, a group of archaeologists who identify as Indians are known as the Closet Chickens. They had some discussions trying to identify Indians in archaeology with advanced degrees. And so various people put forward different lists. And as far as I can determine, at that point in time, about 2008, they identified about 60-some people through the 20th century who identified as Indians and had advanced degrees in one field or another. And at this point in 2008, I think they identified maybe 20-some people with advanced degrees in anthropology. And of those, only a few were archaeologists. And so tonight I'd like to welcome Carlton Gover and Emily Van Alst. Is that how you say your name, Emily?
Yeah, you pronounced it perfectly.
Great, good. Well, I'd like to welcome you two to join our family tonight and share with us some of your insights into this new field, Indigenous Archaeology. I've been out of the picture for a while, so I'm eager to hear what your assessment is and what your thinking is about this new field. So I just wanted to offer a few comments and to welcome you both to this evening. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Roger, for that introduction. I can share the presentation, Emily, if that's all right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sweet. Share screen. What did I just do with that? Okay, so yeah, guys, thank you, Echo Hawk family, for inviting us to speak to you guys tonight on Indigenous archaeology, something that both Emily and I are very passionate about, and this is what has framed our work in the field of archaeology. And so we kind of threw a couple of prominent books Indigenous archaeology as a whole has kind of been becoming prevalent and rising since the late 1980s. And just quick introductions for who we are. Just so you guys know where I am in the Gover family, my uppit is Philip Gover, sometimes goes by Woods. And then my father is George Elliott Gover. And there's that picture right here with his siblings, Philip Gover, people call him Chief, Charlie, and my Aunt Clementine and my Aunt Phyllis. And this was at a war dance a couple years ago. So you can see where I am coming from in terms of the family line. So, and then I am a PhD student, almost a candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Department of Anthropology.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me here with all of you today. And thank you, Roger and Lance, for organizing. Happy Wash Day, Matakio Yapi, Chante Wash Day, Nepi Chiu Zapi, Emily Amachi Yapi, Lakota na Ojibwe, Hamachaye, Bridgewater, Maine, Hamatahan, Indiana, Elwati. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Van Alst. I am Lakota and Ojibwe. I am part of the Heihaka Oyate, or elk altar, and I do Sundance and ceremony on Parent Indian Reservation with the Two Lance and Brooks family. Though I consider myself to be a suburban Indian because I grew up in Maine and Connecticut, which is my mom's side of the family. I am currently at Indiana University. I'm a PhD candidate now. And my dissertation research is really focused on understanding Lakota women's relationship with rock art, and specifically their relationship to images of elk. My family does an elk ceremony every year. And so I'm trying to understand how the ceremony we do today is reflected in the rock art that our ancestors created. And I'm doing this through a sort of indigenous archaeology landscape approach. So yeah, that's me.
Excellent. All right. Do you want me to take this slide down?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So you guys have brought us here tonight to talk about indigenous archaeology. And so what is it? Well, there's been a couple definitions that have been thrown around. The first one that you've seen here on the screen is kind of like a highly academic definition. But me and Emily both kind of prefer the more simpler definition by the same author. And indigenous archaeology is an approach in archaeology that is for, by, and with indigenous peoples in interpreting the archaeological record. Which means indigenous archaeology is a collaborative approach, not consultative. And many of you are attorneys or related to attorneys, and you're familiar with NAGPRA and how you need to consult with indigenous peoples. And this model of consultation, and archaeologists from European backgrounds have tried it before. And all consultation means is you just find the descendant community, ask them what they think about their research, and you really don't have to necessarily care about their opinion, right? You can just disregard it as a whole. But a collaborative approach is including indigenous communities, not only from the beginning, but including their thoughts and beliefs as part of your research design. So you have indigenous peoples with you from the beginning all the way to the end, and they're intertwined in the whole process. And this is kind of, this approach and collaboration is increasing. And for an example, CU Boulder has been contracted by the Department of the Interior to work on the Chop and Mesa Museum, which is the museum at Mesa Verde. And so it's CU Boulder Museums and anthropologists, Crow Canyon Archaeology Foundation, Mesa Verde National Park, and the 20+ descendant communities. And this is this ongoing project that we have committed to that brought the 20+ descendant communities from the beginning, and they've never done something like this before. So when we originally went out to meet with them, you know, they asked us like, what do you want to do? What's the plan? Like, what do you need from us? And we were like, no, we don't have a plan. You're going to be a part of this. Like, we need you guys to tell us what you want. And to I don't think to anyone's surprise, The National Park Service actually hasn't been a huge fan of this approach, because all of a sudden the archaeologists and the museum studies people are on the side of the descendant communities and not on the side of the Park Service. And that's kind of thrown things a little bit for a whack. But we're moving forward, and it seems like it's going to go well. So we're really excited for that project. But it's a really great example. And even when dealing with 20 plus communities, right, we're talking about Southern Ute, Navajos, Pueblos, Apaches, and bringing all their ideas into this new museum and what Mesa Verde means for these larger communities has been interesting. And it's, you know, some of those communities don't get along, but we're working through it and we're all working together. And this is something that hasn't been done before on a national level.
I can talk about this one, Carlton. So I just wanted to give us a little brief history of Indigenous archaeology. And so there's sort of two things going on when we think about the history. So you have Native American activism, and you have AIM in the 1960s and 70s. You also have the passing of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. I don't have to say this to a bunch of lawyers, but you guys know. And so then there's also NAGPRA that's being passed. But what's interesting too, out of that activism in the 60s and 70s, is the formation of cultural studies. So in academia, you have Black studies, Chicano studies, and Native study departments starting to form in programs. And so you have more Native academics and scholars in the academy. And, you know, we on the first slide had Linda Tawahi Smith, who's of Maori descent, who works in New Zealand, but her book, Decolonizing Methodologies, people are starting to think about this effort of decolonization. What does it look like in academia, but what does it look like more broadly? What do community members who are doing this sort of on the ground activism, what do they think might be best when we're thinking about decolonizing? And so then archaeologists, because they like to borrow from Native American and Indigenous studies a lot, start thinking of this concept of multivocality, which is sort of this concept of how do we start thinking about people in the past, but not just from the perspective of white men, but how do we think about women in the past, children in the past, people who aren't part of an elite status, so poor people in the past, what does that look like? And then how do we involve in the contemporary more diversity within archaeology and specifically archaeologists? And so then you have a few Indigenous archaeologists that start coming into the field, and Native people become a little more interested in archaeology. I think part of that is the passing of NAGPRA, where we have to ethically tell white people and white archaeologists to be ethical and start repatriating ancestors and materials that have been taken by anthropologists in the past. You know, Vine Deloria publishes Red Earth, White Lies, which anthropologists have to sort of reckon with their past and some of the bad things that they have done. Carlton, do you want to talk a little bit more about the ancient one? I know you're a little more savvy on that front.
Yeah, so as this is going on and NAGPRA is being passed, and around the same time Red Earth, White Lies is published, you know, we have what we call the Ancient One controversy, which most people refer to it as the Kennewick Man. Ancient One is more respectful of the descendant communities of the Northwest Coast. And that was a 20-year process that really challenged NAGPRA and the interpretations of NAGPRA. So although we have legislation being passed in the 90s that's that is forcing anthropologists, museum people, museum professionals to work with Indigenous, you know, we have a select group of archaeologists that refuse to change and drag this out and continue to create mistrust with Indigenous communities and professionals in anthropology and museum studies. And, you know, it took a presidential order by President Obama to interred the Ancient One back home. And through that whole process, right, of, you know, it's Doug Owsley and his cronies at the Smithsonian, and, you know, trying to get DNA analysis. And while this whole controversy is going on, people don't necessarily realize that the Society of American Archaeology and all these other archaeological communities are advocating on behalf of the Indigenous people and are fighting Doug Owsley to bring the remains home. So it's this select group of archaeologists, but it gets widely publicized and continues to demonize the field of anthropology. And while this is going on, Roger publishes a pretty substantial article in American Antiquity of Ancient History in the New World, Integrating Oral Traditions and the Archaeological Record in Deep Time. And in this article, which part of it is based off of Roger's thesis from CU Boulder, Roger's advocating that we need to treat indigenous oral traditions like equal lines of evidence, and that we need to investigate these oral traditions like we would any other source of information. And this is, it's 20 years old now, but it's still widely read in our field because Roger did such a great job, and he uses, Pawnee and Arikara oral traditions as case studies for how you can look at these things strategically, that's the word, to find information within these oral traditions that can help us interpret the past. And then we have a couple more books starting being written, especially after the 2000s, some of these large edited volumes that we showed at the first slide. And then right now, our SAA president, the Society of American Archaeologists, which is the home organization for more than 10,000 archaeologists in North and South America. Our current president is Joe Watkins, and I think he's Choctaw.
Yeah, he's Choctaw.
Yeah. And recently, within this past year, as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, we now have the Indigenous Archaeologists Collective. I'm really not sure how that works. I know the people in it, but I don't know how to become a member. But they're advocating more of these indigenous issues in the face of Black Lives Matter, and how the Academy still has ways to go in order to change.
Do you want to go, Carlton, or do you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, go.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. No, I was just going to say, so essentially, Indigenous archaeology has been very theoretical thus far. But it's sort of like, how does this actually help communities? Especially being, I'm pretty cognizant of the fact that I'm an Indian academic, right? So I have a lot of privilege of being in academia and having a lot of resources. And, this is great to do as a dissertation project and part of the field, but how does it actually help my community? How does it help your community? How does it help Indigenous people more broadly? And so, Carlton and I were thinking about this, and a lot of it is this sort of idea of reclaiming. So reclaiming cultural heritage, reclaiming sacred and important sites. I know for my own family, it wasn't until I happened to find this rock art book that we realized that we had, all of these different rock art sites that have this ceremony that we do. And so it's like, how do we reclaim that? And maybe that's ownership, maybe that's co-management. I'm not sure exactly. I hope that it goes in that direction at some point. Just for an example, Sonia Adelaide, who wrote the community-based participatory research and archaeology book, she, before that book, actually worked with the Saginaw Chippewa tribe of Michigan. And her community members ended up getting co-management over a rock art site. The way that it was being preserved, it was a rock art site sort of on the ground. It was completely surrounded by fencing and covered. And the archaeologist of the state park was like, well, this is the best way to preserve it. That way we can keep people out. And this Chippewa community was like, no, actually, it's best if the rock art is completely exposed. People can walk on it. We need to be able to water it. It has a specific relationship to the waterways around it. And so that co-management and ownership can actually help the actual material culture or the heritage that may be preserved in a Western way, but it isn't necessarily the way that the Indigenous community wants it to be. So Indigenous archaeology and thinking about how do Indigenous people look at their cultural heritage can be a really helpful outcome when it comes to Indigenous archaeology. And then, this sort of reclaiming is part of repatriation and returning objects that may be in museums or other institutions where they shouldn't be. That's another huge part of Indigenous archaeology. And then sort of, not that we have to prove to non-Native people certain stories or history, but sometimes Indigenous archaeology can sort of confirm some sort of history that an Indigenous group may have. Carlton, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, and just, as we've seen in the past couple decades in language revitalization, in that we now have indigenous linguists who are going through linguistic programs or linguistic anthropology programs. Having indigenous archaeologists who are working in indigenous archaeology provides a way for us to go through basically kind of this cultural renaissance, right? Like at the time of when we were trading with the French, and this is a Pawnee example, the French, Spanish, and English with metal goods, we stopped making our own pottery out of clay. And that happened for 200 years and the practice was lost. But through indigenous archaeology or looking at the archaeological record, we can bring back some of our old traditions that were before contact. And that's not just the pottery, even looking at how earth lodges have changed over time, or some of our different material culture. And this is, a way that we can bring back some of our culture that hasn't been lost, but has just kind of been dormant. So archaeology provides this way of being able to do so, as we're seeing in some other fields, and specific, we see it with the seed preservation program that we have going on through Deb Echohawk, some of these similar strategies with the language. And many tribal nations now are employing tribal archaeologists to do such things as part of their cultural divisions. And they're not replacing their tribal historic preservation officers or the NAGPRA officers, but they're assisting them because they have a different background and knowledge that can assist. And more importantly, for the Pawnee Nation, I work with Matt Reed already, our TIPO, because sometimes he gets these reports on pipelines and he doesn't know how to interpret it. And this has like a real world context, right? Where Keystone Pipeline is going through our ancestral homeland, and some of our people, our TIPO isn't necessarily has the background to work on these cases. So it's an assisting. So it's not only just reclaiming cultural heritage, but also protecting it from some of these outside entities that would rather see it gone in order for profit. And it's working within an indigenous framework, right?
So,
truth be told, this whole project started at a bar one day at SA's in Albuquerque when me and Emily were talking about the need for this book. So that's how this whole thing started.
Yep.
But Emily, go ahead.
Yeah. So Carlton and I met each other, 3 years ago, I think, at this point. And it was just so nice to meet another Indigenous archaeologist, helping their community and really doing the work. And so, over probably a year and a half, we met each other at conferences and kept chatting about Indigenous archaeology. And then, one night we were like, we need to bring together all the new up and coming young Indigenous archaeologists. Like, I know they exist, know they're out there, but they don't really have a platform yet. And so what we were going to do is all have a conference session that was devoted to the different types of archaeology that all of us are doing. Then COVID happened and it got canceled, but we were lucky enough that the University of Florida Press reached out and said that they wanted to do an edited volume. So essentially each of the different archaeologists that we invited to give a paper would just turn their paper into a chapter. And so Carlton and I didn't want it to be this big theoretical book again. We want it to be sort of a how-to. So when, somebody comes to you and they're like, what is Indigenous archaeology? You're like, okay, this is what it is, but this is actually how you do it on the ground. This is how you talk to a community. So to our surprise, there's actually a lot of Indigenous archaeologists now. So we have about 11, representing all different nations sort of across North America. We even have somebody from who's First Nations, she's Plains Cree, from Canada. And so we have a good mix of a bunch of different, Indigenous scholars. And what's really great about this group is not only all their different, backgrounds, but that they're integrating their very specific communities, cultural backgrounds and values into the archaeology that they do. And so Carlton and I have talked a lot about what do we think Indigenous archaeology is? Well, we think it's Indigenous archaeologies, plural, where every Indigenous archaeologist is working with a different community, and each community is going to have a different need or want or research question And so, yes, it is a framework, but it's going to be very specific to each community that an Indigenous archaeologist is working with. Carlton, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, so as Emily mentioned, the other works that have been done in Indigenous archaeology have been pretty theoretical, and they're meant for people in academia. So we really wanted to make a methods book, and we're gearing it towards college students, TIPOs, NACPR officers, and tribal archaeologists. It's meant for everybody to learn how to do it, not for people that, we don't want to put it behind a paywall. We don't want it just to be read by doctors or master students. So we really wanted to write something that will be meaningful and give future archaeologists a guide in how they can make their how they can be Indigenous archaeologists, because you don't have to be Indigenous to be an Indigenous archaeologist, and that's something more and more people are starting to do that are non-Indigenous, have Indigenous colleagues that work with them on everything. And so we think it's especially important for young professionals to know how to do it early on in their career, so it becomes foundational to who they are as an academic. So I think, yes, Emily, go ahead.
So sort of the future, I guess, definitely want some more Indigenous archaeologists. So, I mean, I think there might be enough of us at this point. We've talked about having an Indigenous archaeology conference that's just for people who are practicing Indigenous archaeology and are Indigenous archaeologists. So more people are getting interested in really doing community-based work at the end of it, and doing what the descendant and Indigenous communities are asking archaeologists to do. A lot of it too is repatriation and returning ancestors and artifacts. Carlton and I have talked about, there's other materials that different institutions like libraries have. So different stories, anthropologists took people's songs, language, there's archival material. I've talked to a few Ojibwe people who've come down from Michigan to Indiana, and there's seeds and plants that IU holds and that they would like back. So thinking about all the different types of sort of material culture more broadly that need to be repatriated and returned. And Carlton and I have also argued that Indigenous archaeology just needs to become the way that people practice archaeology in North America. If you're doing archaeology, you're digging on, soil in North America, you are on Indian land. That's just how it is. And so people need to become more cognizant of whose land they are digging on and what communities they aren't or are interacting with. And just that tribal archaeologists should become a staple in cultural resource divisions and tribal colleges, tribal museums. I'm fortunate enough to work on a project with the Salish Kootenai Tribal College in Montana, and they have a tribal preservation department. It's two Indigenous archaeologists, but they are training TIPOs, and they have different community members. You have Cheyenne and Assiniboine and all sorts of different native groups in Montana. Well, they send their kids to SKC, and then they learn how to be tribal preservation officers, and they have a TIPO. And so I think programs like that can be really, really helpful. So it's not just a bunch of Indigenous, archaeologists, academics, but it's people who are on the ground who are going to be, reading reports about pipelines, and be able to, protect sacred sites and start to do that repatriation and that returning.
All right. So yeah, thank you guys for letting us talk to you guys and give you a brief overview of what Indigenous archaeology is. And if you guys have any questions, we're here for it.
I have a question. I'm wondering, now Carlton, you have a close working relationship with the Pawnee Nation Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Any other heritage programs in the Pawnee Nation? I wonder if you could describe for us some of the activities that the office office undertakes. And Emily, I would like to hear from you as well about seen firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely, Roger. So, we have in the Cultural Resource Division of the Pawnee Nation, we have Herb Adson, who's the director, and Adrian Spotted Horse Chief, who's an employee. I'm not sure what his actual title is. And then separated from that, you have the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, which is Matt Reed, and the NAGPRA officer, who is Marty Only, a chief. And most of what I work with Matt on, our TIPO, is pipeline reports and survey reports, and just kind of general education as to the archaeological record. He's having me come down to Pawnee, Oklahoma in December to conduct a tribal monitoring class for some of the community members, so we can have some tribal monitors on the Keystone Pipeline and some other surveys, infrastructure surveys. And mostly what I work with Matt is we're starting to look at, from an academic standpoint, Matt and I have both been really interested in Pawnee chronology in terms of where our villages and when, because they're not really well documented. So we really just message each other about where the location of sites are and what the data is on them, and trying to figure out if we can identify bands in the archaeological record, like who's who and where. And that ties into a lot of the stuff that I do with you, Roger, and Dr. Bamforth. And then there's some museum stuff that's in the background behind that. But predominantly my work with the TIPO is consultation on cultural resources management reports.
Yeah, so right now, our TIPO is somebody who's not very present. And so this is the TIPO for Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And so unfortunately, a lot of projects have sort of fallen on the wayside. But one of the main projects that some community members would like is Harvard University. I apparently sent out a group of archaeologists in the way back in the day. So around when the Wounded Knee Massacre happened and apparently took objects. So one of the things that Pine Ridge TIPO is interested in is getting some of those objects repatriated. So that's one thing. There was another project related to rock art. There's this very isolated rock art area called the Cave Hills National Forest. It's in the northern part of South Dakota. So it's a little further away from Pine Ridge, but there are a lot of community members who know that there are sacred springs and sites and rock art there, and so are interested in how to, sort of reclaim that area, potentially go there and visit. The problem is that there was strip mining done in the 60s and 70s, and so one part of that area is actually just like really unhealthy to go to because of the high risk of radiation. Which is really unfortunate, but it's a project. They've started cleaning up the area, which is good, but that's something that some community members are really interested in, is reclaiming that specific rock art site. And so that's sort of on the community level. The larger community level, I know for my family, they're really interested in the research I'm doing, so trying to find more sort of information about this elk dance, and sort of, what is the history? How long have we been practicing that? And so I'm looking through old ethnographies and archival material to see, has that elk dance been documented in any other way? And it has. I was this summer, because of COVID, couldn't go do interviews with family, but I did find that there was an elk dance performed the night before the Battle of Greasy Grass. So that is the oldest sort of historical record we have of the elk dance. So that would have been 1874. And my uncle, who is a elk dancer, was incredibly excited about this because he had no idea that we, ancestors had done this the night before the Battle of Greasy Grass. So I know specifically my family is really interested in this type of research that I'm doing.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Emily. That brings to mind a second question that I'm I'm interested in, and this is a little bit more esoteric, but you touched on it, and that is the use of oral information, family traditions, oral history. I think it might be nice if we could touch a little bit more on Joe Watkins and his contribution to this field. But let's see if we get to that. But meanwhile, I'm really interested in what you have to say about, tapping your family stories that can plug into some of this information. And the larger issue for me is trying to get a grasp in my mind about what indigenous archaeology is and some of the projects that it could be developing, pursuing. Oral tradition, as Carlton so kindly mentioned, my work, a lot of my work has had to do with inquiring into that. And so I've been real interested to watch as Indians inter-archaeology and indigenous archaeology sort of took shape and has taken off. Can either of you shed any light on the status of oral tradition in archaeology today? And, I've seen this as a long-term kind of thing that will eventually develop. But I've been curious, am I missing out on things? Is there a growing level of entrance of oral tradition into archaeological literature that you do have become aware of, or is this still like on the coming horizon?
Usually when people do use oral traditions, it's used as like a part of the conclusion that if it's by non-Indigenous people, it's merely stating like, oh yeah, by the way, the Indigenous people support this, their oral traditions support these conclusions. The Southwest has a long history of debating with the Puebloan groups as to where the Pueblo came from. And it's really within the past decade that several archaeologists, Scott Ortman from Sioux Boulder, has taken them seriously and has done what you've done, Roger, and worked with Indigenous groups to really show confirmation of some of these Puebloan oral traditions regarding migration. I've seen a couple cases here and there, one in the Northwest to understand site use. It's not as prevalent as it should be, but it is starting to gain traction. And it's usually with archaeologists that work very closely with descendant communities. So it's not like archaeologists are going out of their way to learn the oral traditions. It's mostly been a byproduct of being collaborating with Indigenous peoples and being privy to that knowledge. Because some of these oral traditions are not in the literature, right? So you need community access and community trust to be able to get to those. And in the Southwest, that's particularly hard. That has a very long and dark history of pretty colonial practices in archaeology. In the Plains, it's talked about. I know some work that's looked at our ancestral material has talked briefly about Pawnee oral traditions, but nothing in depth, just passing by. I think the people that work with the Seminole and I think the Choctaw have started to use more oral traditions, but I'm totally unsure. But it's not as prevalent as it should be. And they all cite you, Roger.
Yeah, if somebody's going to talk about oral traditions in archaeology, it's Echo Hawk 2000. Actually just put that citation in a grant that I'm writing. But it's been interesting that I have seen it a little bit more. Of archaeologists talking about it. But I do think that a lot of what Indigenous archaeology is doing here in North America is definitely influenced by what's happening in Australia. Because for whatever reason, Australia is miles ahead when it comes to working with Indigenous people. And so a lot of Aboriginal Australian communities are working with Australian archaeologists, and that's all they do is oral traditions, and oral histories. And so I'm seeing more and more come out about that. There's a really great book. I cannot remember the author's name off the top of my head, and it just came out like this year, and it's about this concept of story work. So how different Indigenous communities here, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, using oral history and oral traditions to sort of inform contemporary practices of Indigenous people. But here in North America, I think people are starting to take it more seriously, so to speak. I think it'll show up a bit more once we get our edited volume published, and have some more Indigenous archaeologists publishing about some of these things. But everybody I've talked to who's sort of in the sort of group that Carlton and I are in are like, oh yes, definitely oral traditions, oral histories, that has to be a part of what we're doing when we're doing this sort of Indigenous archaeology work.
Another issue I would ask both of you if you have any insights on, and that is, in Carlton's case, what is your evaluation of the level of interest in Pawnee land among other Pawnees in,
it's been,
well, also in,
yeah.
not just in understanding archaeology, but in thinking about pursuing some kind of scholarship or study, whether it's in an academic environment or not. Do you have a sense of the Pawnee interest in archaeology?
I don't think I have a good accurate way to describe it. I mean, no one's asked me to like turn in my CIB card yet, so I think that's a positive. But generally when people talk to me about it, they're interested. It's just, questions, how long we've been here, or just questions about culture. I'd be overjoyed if I found a middle school student or a high school student in Pawnee that wanted to learn and thought about it. But I'm just not in Pawnee around enough as is to really engage with the community the way that I want. And that's why we're doing that. I'm doing that talk on Pawnee land for the museum in 2 weeks, and working more and going to Pawnee more to work with the community, just to let them know, like, I'm here, and if I'm here to answer any questions you guys might have and do research that you guys want to have done. Walter seems interested. I think he's starting to see the value in Indigenous archaeology, and the people that work at the CRD have been overwhelmingly positive with my research and what I do, and I think my family as well. So,
Carlton,
yes, ma'am.
if I may, Ronnie, are you on the line? I pulled over at a rest stop. I started at checking my watch at the Republic River, and now I'm at a rest stop south of Minneapolis. So Barbara, I know you're jealous, but anyway, the comment I have is you better come and see me when you come to town.
Mm-hmm.
There's, I don't know what you're doing your dissertation on, but we do have one amazing gardener, Bill Bolt, who has spent how many years, Ronnie, on his work, and he's determined the trail where the Pawnees went to see the Wichita.
Okay.
And he's got that documented. He's got some of our old gardens that had berm hills around them. Those are the kinds of things that when Adrian years ago went up to check on pipeline stuff for sites, I said, well, what about the gardens? Those are sacred sites in my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's still something that we're looking at. This year we're going to take pictures and make a poster of the seeds that we have now that we were able to bring back, and have them match what was done with the will and hide work, to show that we still have the same crops now.
Okay.
And that's a documentation that one of our grad students is working on. She's Kahita Bernonsky, and she's at UNL online, due to COVID. But
Mhm.
she's in Pawnee and helping out. So there's just some topics that I think really need to be clarified and documented more and substantiated.
I agree. That'd be fascinating. We were just talking about Pawnee agriculture the other day, and I have a note to actually reach out to you on Facebook for a question I had. But I'll be in Pawnee December 15th for a week or so. And if you're around then, I'd love to get together with you guys and just chat and see what I can do, how I can help.
That would be lovely. Thank
Yeah.
you.
We
I-
need a couple
I
of
think I'll get
hours.
back in the car now.
We need a couple of hours with just Carlton.
Yes, at least.
I love it. I look
At
forward to it.
least.
At least.
Now,
So-
Emily, oh, sorry, Ronnie, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I just want you to, Carlton, I just want to say that my dad grew up just north of Palmer, where
Mhm.
a
The
lot
Palmer
of these sites wind up being. So, my interest in that area too is just off the charts. To know, what history my dad was living in the middle of, grew up in the middle of. And a great deal of respect for that. But yes, you really do need to get with Bill Bolte. He's incredible, and he's very adaptable. He's very open. He's not full of himself at all. But he has done so much on the ground
Yes.
research, and I've seen the swales, and I'm sure Deb has too, of the trail. I mean, he can show you where it is
Mhm.
because he's found it, and it's pretty neat. It's amazing what he's found.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm hoping at least within the near future to move to Pawnee if we can get this our new cultural center up and going. I'd like to work there and live in Pawnee finally. But I plan to be around a lot, and I'd love to sit down and chat. I know we were actually looking at grinding posts and earth lodges and trying to see how far back you can trace them in time where they used to grind up corn. And I've been looking at a lot of earth lodges, trying to figure out where those posts are. And people, before the 60s just thought they were another anomalous wood post. And we think we figured out what's going on. So yeah, no, I'd love to sit down and see what I can do. I mean, this stuff is what I live for.
Yeah, it's cool.
Now, Emily, you mentioned that the Pine Ridge depot is not very active or needs to develop more. And so what is your evaluation for the state of community archaeology at Pine Ridge and the interest on the part of other Pine Ridge Sioux in archaeology?
I think that there is still sort of this tension that exists because there are not a lot of Lakota archaeologists, and archaeologists and anthropologists, especially anthropologists, have not been very kind to Lakota people. And this still happens today. There are people who graduated from the institution I am at who did not go through a research review board of the Oglala Sioux and still did dissertation research. And so there's definitely mistrust between Lakota people and anthropologists. And I completely 100% agree with them. Like there are not great anthropologists out there. But being Lakota, being an archaeologist, I have a very particular position and sort of walk that sort of boundary. And I think, especially after Standing Rock and the fact that there were archaeologists who ignored tribal concerns when it came to that pipeline, and what the pipeline company dug through, I think that there's going to be a lot of healing that needs to happen between archaeologists and Lakota people. But I think that there are some community members who really would like there to be a better relationship. And I think doing talks like these, honestly, I think what you guys are doing is really great, of doing these sort of community Zoom sessions. I think having those conversations about what can archaeology actually help and how can it benefit Native people can be really helpful. Unfortunately, on Pine Ridge, the TIPO sort of just gets filled. And it's not necessarily someone who wants to do that sort of community work, which is why I think having young Indigenous people enroll in tribal preservation programs so that they are trained to be TIPOs and know how to do Indigenous archaeology and community work, I think could be really, really beneficial to Pine Ridge and to other Native communities. You know, it's great that Carlton is, you know, getting his PhD at CU Boulder right now, and can go back to Pawnee and help and do some of this community-based stuff. So I think Pine Ridge can get there. I just think it's going to take a lot of conversations with the community to do that kind of work.
And you know, archaeology just isn't digging in the ground. And in terms of like stuff that I'd like to do is, if we do get this new cultural center, partner it with the Pawnee College at high school, because in terms of the benefits of STEM that archaeology provides to inspire a next generation of Pawnees or Indigenous people outside of, you know, law or Indian studies, but to get in and bring Pawnee and Indigenous perspectives into earth sciences, into water preservation, like these things are all interconnected, right? And from an archaeological background, I need help. Like, I tell your grandkids, become archaeologists, because like I can't do it all. There's way too much cool stuff of our past that I can't explore, and it's just me and, you know, Roger and like 3 other people work in Pawnee land throughout time and space, and that's just too much ground for us to cover. And I love working, like getting to go back to some of our ancestral sites and to uncover the old living surfaces where our ancestors used to walk. It's like it's a spiritual experience to find some of these things, like the Lynch site that I work at now. That's where we think was the last village before the Skeeties and Arikaras split. And to find an old pipe from the 1300s where you can see where the pipe maker he was either talking to his friend or wasn't paying attention and broke the top off, broke the stem. And to think about what conversation was he doing, was his kid messing around and he stopped paying attention? And to put myself into those moments and to pick up things from our ancestors, it's an experience that I hope to share. And I think, you know, we brought last summer before COVID, we brought Matt Reed, Marty Only a Chief, and Patsy Cooper as part of the CRD. They came up to visit. And I remember Patsy was talking to me, and because the site's over a mile long, full of earth lodges. And Patsy Cooper asked us, you know, she's like, how many Pawnees used to live here? A couple hundred? And I was like, no, Patsy, thousands. And the way to see her eyes just light up to think of that many Pawnees in one place. It's like those moments are special. I'm not in this for academic accolade. I want to come home to Pawnee and work with the tribe and answer questions about our past and help out. You know, I'm not in this for myself. If I wanted to get money, I would have become a lawyer or gone into marketing. You know, I'm here to do what I can. I love history, and I love more of the tribe's history. I thought going in as a master's student, their archaeologists had already known everything about Pawnee history, and I could just go be an underwater archaeologist in Yucatan and check out ancient temples. And to my surprise, when none of this work has been done, it's on my shoulders to look at these things and work. And, you know, for everyone here, I can't stress enough the importance of Roger's work at CU Boulder when he was a master's student, and the stuff that he's done. All my research is basically what Roger's figured out. I'm just applying mathematical models to it. So Roger, your relative here, has been very pivotal into the field of archaeology as a whole, but also within my research. And there's not many people like Roger like that in our field. You know, he's treasured, not only to myself, but to other Indigenous archaeologists. He started a lot of this. outside of the theory. He's the one that called on archaeologists to really look at indigenous oral traditions as real histories and to look at them for data. And without that, I don't know.
Now, you mentioned the Lynch site and Patsy Cooper and others coming up to visit there. The Echohawk family, we are talking about developing some kind of program that would be sponsored by the family to do various things. If we can get something off the ground, we are going to necessarily start very modestly, but one issue that has come up in our talks in the past is Pawnee removal, and the fact that so much archaeology, the Lynch site, is in northern Nebraska, in the ancient Pawnee homeland. Lance and Walter and I, we spent time visiting Pawnee sites in Nebraska, very special experience for us. Deb and Ronnie are at the forefront of bringing Pawnee land back to the ancient Pawnee homeland. That's a very important project right there. And so one thing we've talked about is there a role for our family in helping to reestablish contacts back into the ancient homeland? And the project that I've kind of brought up, and we haven't really, I don't know where this will end up, but at some point I'm going to get in touch with Rob Bozell.
Mm-hmm.
He's the state archaeologist. He's still the state archaeologist.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's a state archaeologist in Nebraska. And we may well want to see if we can play some kind of a modest role in developing a program where there would be periodic, maybe even annual or regular tours that where Pawnees can go back to the homeland under the guidance of a person like Rob Bozell or you, Carlton,
Mm-hmm.
and go back and visit some of these Pawnee sites, as you mentioned that Patsy did, describing her response to some of the things you said, standing there at an ancient site occupied by some of our ancestors. Very meaningful experience. And so I am just curious what your thoughts are listening to what I'm saying. And Emily, I'd also like to hear what you would have to say. I mean, Pine Ridge Sioux, and did you mention your Ojibwe too? Well, those people are scattered out everywhere. And I'm just guessing that having some kind of connection to ancestral places where their ancestors were born and lived and died, that this kind of a program could be very important in this age of diaspora for all of our communities. And so I'd like to hear you too, if you have any observations on this kind of a project.
Yeah, I think starting off, I think it's great that you guys want to do this. I wish the nation would take upon it itself to do this for its people. I can see it absolutely a value and totally support it. And we were talking the other day because we're going back to Lynch this summer, hopefully, depending on COVID. And we want to we're still trying to get you out there, Roger, and to bring back the CRD now that there's more interest in what I'm doing now 2 years than 2 years ago. But also meeting Rob Bozell at the site, but also meeting the Iowa, Omaha, and Ponca Tippos there too. Because, that site is it's our ancient homeland, but their current homeland. And to bring more tribes together to talk about some of these ancient relationships. But I promote it. I mean, I've been calling it the Pawnee pilgrimage of going back to a lot of these sites. And I've been trying to get myself to go with Rob Bozell for a number of years now. I think it's hugely important. A lot of my relatives are Shoshone, and I lived on Wind River for a while. And I noticed, like, the Shoshone who still live there, they're able to talk about places. They have the sense of theirs and what is theirs, and that's their home, and the way they talk about it. You know, and it's different when you go to Pawnee, and when, you know, we talk about the old days in Nebraska, the old home, the old rivers. You know, the Shoshone are still next to the Wind River. We're not next to the Platte or the Loop anymore, or the Republican. So in terms of just benefiting young Pawnees in terms of mental health and in terms of identity, I think it's extremely important. And whatever I can do to support, if the Echo Hawk family wants to take that upon themselves to do a test run to send a couple kids on a trip, I'd be happy to tag along and tell them what I know about our history in Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere. I think it's extremely important, and I really hope you guys can pull it off, and maybe Walter can make it a part of what the nation does to support its citizens.
Yeah, I think this is a fantastic idea. I know I was on a call for the World Monument Fund, which is this like weird organization that is interested in getting people UNESCO World Heritage recognition for certain archaeological sites or historic sites of importance. And I was on a call with a few Navajo and Pueblo people, and they are trying to figure out how to get World Monument Fund partnered with what they're doing down at Bears Ears National Monument, which is, you know, full of archaeology, but also a lot of sacred sites. And a lot of the Pueblo and Navajo archaeologists were talking about the importance of bringing the youth there back to this, you know, this ancient place is what they kept calling it. So very similar to ancient Pawnee homelands, and bringing youth, but also bringing elders there and bringing them back to this place that ancestors were. And I know for my own community, we've talked a lot about the Black Hills. So the Black Hills are the site of Lakota emergence. And there are so many archaeological sites there today. There's stone circles, there's rock art sites, and just in general sacred areas for us. But a lot of Lakota people don't live there because it's been overrun by white people and tourism, because you have Mount Rushmore and those sorts of places. But I think, you know, having the ability to actually bring people to specific places where our ancestors were, I think is so vital. There's a rock art site in the Black Hills. It's called Whoop Up Canyon. It's actually on the Wyoming side of the Black Hills, but it has a depiction of an elk that is 12,000 years old. And my uncle is like, I know that is a Lakota made thing. That is Lakota rock art through and through. I cannot get my family access because the U.S. Forest Service has blocked it, because they're like, this is some of the oldest rock art in the Black Hills. Nobody can go near it. And it's like, but it's Lakota. It's in the Black Hills. That is a place that we should be able to go whenever we need to go. And so this sort of accessibility issue is something that I've become really interested in while doing my research. What is accessible to Native people? What isn't? There's another rock art site in Wyoming that's all the rock art has fencing around it, so you can't even go up and touch it. And the Shoshone and Arapaho people I've talked to about it are like, there shouldn't be any fencing. We should just be able to walk up to it and be able to touch it, because that's how we interact with it. So I think in general, this accessibility issue, I think we need to bring Native people to these sites. I think we need to bring people essentially home, and be able to interact with these places that our ancestors did in the way that we need to interact with them. So I think what you brought up, Roger, I think this is a great idea, that you guys should go to Lynch and you should be able to have that accessibility and go where your guys' ancestors were. I think that's amazing. That's so cool.
I think that's a good idea on several levels. Personally, Roger did refer to the trip Walter, and I took there, and there was a real emotional component to that for me. I've as a I'm retired now, but as a mental health professional and having an interest in historical trauma, I think there's a lot of healing that Indigenous people need to do. And making those kind of journeys, visiting those kind of places, there's a potent amount of healing power in that. And I think it was Carlton that you referred to, helping people get settled in their identity. And I think that would just be powerful. So I like seeing an idea like this on the table. Don't know where it'll go. Don't know what we can do about it, but I like it out there on the table.
This is Helen. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Helen. Welcome to the.
Hey. Yeah, I just was listening, and I do notice that the younger children in Pawnee really aren't interested, and a lot of the Pawnee people aren't interested, and I don't understand why. But I'm on the cultural committee, and we went to see the Arikaras, and I was in charge of the women. So we sat there and we had a really good visit, and I was fascinated with. I wanted to know where we came from, and I wanted to know when we split, and I just was truly fascinated by it because they told us that it was on the Elk River is where they decided to split, and that I asked why, and they said because we were too big. There was too many of us. And then I wanted to know how did they decide who was going to go up and stay up north and all that. And they said, and I think this is so fascinating, and nobody's interested in it in Pawnee, but they shot an arrow. And if this arrow went to a certain, where it stopped, then those mud lodges that's where the split was. So I was fascinated by that because there's no one that I know of in Pawnee now, besides Uncle Brummett, who has the arrow and the bow, and my cousin John, Knife Chief, does. So I was asking him how far that would go, and he was telling me it could go really far because I didn't see it. It's just absolutely fascinating. But when we were there, we found out the Arikaras, they don't have very many ceremonies, and they were fascinated in ours. So I'm really interested in that, and I think the people of Pawnee would really be interested in it too once someone is able to convince them of how wonderful we once were, and what we did and how brave we were. And they need that, really proud to be Pawnee, and so this could do it. This could do it, but even at our dances and our ceremonies, we don't have that many young people there.
It seems to me if there was some mechanism for people to make those visits, and it was happening, and people came back and shared what their experiences. I don't see how it couldn't take off, personally.
Yeah, they even said that they continued the northern. Oh, I guess another thing that's absolutely fascinating that nobody else seems so fascinated was when we were up there, they gave Morgan Littleson a staff, to which we could use now at our dances. But nobody really knows how to use a staff. But on the staff, it had 12 eagle feathers, representing the 12 most important sacred bundles. And so many went to the people who moved down south, us. So many stayed there with the Arikaras, and one went up way up north, Canada. And that staff is at the museum, and nobody asked any questions about it or why. And I just think it's just absolutely wonderful. But, you know, if somebody could tie all this in and, you know, where we actually came from, because I always thought that we came with all the other Indian people from the Bering Strait, and apparently we didn't. You know, we came from the south. Anyway, that's just listening to you all. I really would like to get some of our younger people interested and work on that, or maybe that group when we went up, you know, we I can remember certain things, and then other people can't remember them, or you know, they saw things differently. But we have really good ways, WAYS. Pawnee ways are excellent, and I could see how we had to have those ways in order to survive. Mm-hmm. And you know, I think those ways need to be written down too, because we still have them, and the Arikaras don't.
Well, this is Amy. One thing I was going to share is one of my friends who's passed away, Dave Hatch, who's Siletz, came up with a really brilliant idea of combining, like we were talking about earlier today, like with the STEM aspects of culture and being out in community and being on site and interacting with your people, your stories, your land, and being connected to it. And he invented this thing called Salmon Camp. And it was for middle school students that were native, that were in urban and suburban areas. So Elizabeth, you mentioned you were a suburban Indian. This was a program for that group in particular to give them the opportunity to get out of the city and go into native communities and to do science work. And I worked as a counselor for that one summer, and it was really fantastic. And it built the, like Uncle Lance was talking about, the mental health aspect. It really developed a lot of pride, like Aunt Hella was saying, in people's ways and their culture and their heritage, and a lot of interest. One of the kids in my group was part Aztec, and people were telling him, no, there are no, and he was also part, I can't remember the name of the tribe, but it was one of the island tribes that I think from the Caribbean that Christopher Columbus encountered at one point, and they said that both of his communities are extinct. And he's like, but I'm still here, my mom's still here, so we're not extinct. But it was really cool. And so I think something like that, like Uncle Lance was saying, I think it could only take off, but it really did help the community. It helped those kids. It got them really interested, not only in their culture and their land and being outside of the, like the living room and everything, but going deeper into themselves as who they are, and also getting them interested in a science career. So that might help create some more Indigenous archaeologists.
That is perfect. That is, I sat by Amy when this guy from Arikara, your dad's friend, he was talking to us and we went to dinner. And you remember you were sitting closer to me, but I kept asking these questions. I learned so much. And then I said, Amy, are you taking all this in? And you said, yes, because I couldn't remember it all. Absolutely fascinating. And we've had a lot, you talk about mental health. Oh man, do we need help? Because we've had some suicides. We've had deaths, COVID deaths. I'm trying to figure out a way. I'm working with one of the chiefs, and we're trying to figure out a way for somebody who is really, really ill in the hospital with COVID, how we can get a cedar into the room. Anyway, we're trying to figure that out, but there's a lot of things that we need help with. But yes, with mental health, there's so much depression, so much anger, just, I don't know, like defeated, I don't know.
Well, many of us on this call are kind of out of towners, and I really appreciate the people that are down there in Pawnee, seeing the stuff like that, like what you're talking about, Helen. And it just makes this sort of talk and the kind of efforts that we're maybe pipe dreaming a little bit about that much more important.
Yeah, because it really affects our culture. You know, a lot of times we can't bury within 4 days. We can't have a big service anymore. A lot of people can't come to the funerals. It's just a really odd, strange kind of feeling. What we're, you know, so if you're related to someone and they pass away and you're not around, and I mean, that's where a lot of people learn about our mourning ceremony. We're like the only tribe that I know that has a true mourning ceremony. But if you're not around and you can't go, then you don't know ever, you know, because we have a lot of people that come back for those ceremonies and they say, we didn't know we had this. I never knew this. And, you know, we keep telling them come back. But anyway, it's sad and there's just so much need. So listening, there's hope. Y'all are giving us hope, so that's great.
And before I forget, just from what Helen was just talking about in terms of thinking about the Pawnee Rickrow history, in 2 weeks,
I really want to talk to you.
yeah, and well, in 2 weeks, I'm giving a presentation for the Pawnee Nation
I wrote
Museum.
it down.
Yeah, so yeah, I threw it in the chat there. You got to RSVP with Matt Reed, but I'll be talking about that and looking at like a deep history of Pawnees from, 15,000 years ago up until removal. So I'm hoping I can do it justice in an hour, but there's going to be some. I'll try to get through some of the long parts, but I'll be talking about that again. And I did another talk. It's on YouTube on the Pawnee Nation where I talked more critically about the Pawnee, Ricker, and Wichita splits. But that's what I look at is broad space of Pawnee time and like where are the Wichitas, where are the South Bands, where the Skeety, where did the Arikara go? And I'm trying to get more focused into some other things, but
we have some full bloods, and I really want them to take that genealogy test.
Mm-hmm.
I took it. I am Pawnee with just a dab of Oto. It came back that I was 11% Native American, 3% Japanese, and some others. But that's when I found that. I thought, well, we didn't come across the Bering Strait. We're from down south. So I brought it to our committee that have full bloods on there, and they were really interested in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I want to be cognizant, Emily, I know Emily, it's like 9:30 her time. So if anyone has any last minute questions for Emily, I can stay on for a little bit more, but if you have anything for Em.
I had a quick question for Emily. In the beginning, you used a term, and I didn't quite catch what it meant. Multivocality.
Yes. It's I guess, a fancy archaeology term to basically encompass understanding diverse and populations in the past, so the archaeological past. So thinking about instead of just like elite men in the past, thinking about women and children and like non-elite, so essentially like working class or poor people, but in the archaeological past.
Cool. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, Emily, I also wanted to ask you about other two archaeology offices. Now we've touched on, Helen has gone into some detail about Pawnee and Arikara connections, and there's also in Pawnee land an annual visit with the Wichitas. So a little circle of related communities that have some ties that relate to cultural heritage in Sioux country. Are there tribal archaeologists offices that are present, that are active? I spent a little bit of time. I went up to the Cheyenne River on one occasion, spent a day up there giving advice about repatriation of wounded knee items. And later, I don't know him, but Albert LeBeau became active for a time in Indigenous Archaeology circles. And so I'm just curious how you would characterize archaeology among the different Sioux reservations, communities in general.
Yeah, so I've talked a lot to the TIPO at Fort Peck, and she is Nakota, so related to Lakota people, but she's very active. She is talking to NAGPRA coordinators. She's constantly emailing different institutions on the East Coast who hold ancestors and artifacts, and so she's really fantastic. I know Cheyenne River and Standing Rock, they both have really active TIPOs who are also doing that sort of repatriation work. And I think the Standing Rock are a little more cognizant of things just because of what happened at the Standing Rock, the whole pipeline situation. So that's who I know is really active, but I have to say, historically, the Cheyenne have always been an ally to the Lakota, and they have a really, really great tribal historic preservation office. They've got a main TIPO, they've got TIPOs in training, they have a NAGPRA coordinator, so they're really on it. Unfortunately, I think it just sort of depends on the community and what the tribal president at that time is willing to devote, money and time and energy into archaeology and having a TIPO and those sorts of things. But yeah, I think the Cheyenne are a really great example, actually, of an office that is pretty stable. They've always sort of had a TIPO. And then Standing Rock and Cheyenne River, those two reservations have pretty active TIPOs.
What do you mean by TIPOs?
Yes, I was just going to raise that question, and I noticed a nice little exchange there in the chat room between Amy and Lucille asking and having a little chat about what a TIPO is.
So a TIPO is a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. They're essentially somebody who is elected. I think it depends on the reservation, but they're normally elected by the community. And so there's somebody who would work on, if an institution reaches out about a issue of repatriation, they would review things like construction or pipelines going in. They might, the TIPO and that office might then do a survey of a site, a survey of an area that a pipeline might be going in or some sort of construction. Carlton, if you want to add anything else about TIPO's sort of roles.
Yeah. And then, TIPOs and NAGPRA officers, most tribes have them because it's a federally funded position. So a lot of tribes have them because it's just free federal money to support another person, and there's projects out of it. And with that, it's tribe-based. So the quality of TIPOs, it varies. The Pawnee, we're really fortunate. Like Matt Reed has a background in museum studies, a master's, and he's all about our material culture and understanding this stuff. And we've been pretty good. Michael Knife Chief, our previous TIPO, I was close with him. Me and him used to chat a lot too back when he got it, and I started out at my career. So we've been pretty fortunate. But there's some tribes, the TIPO is just kind of an elder who just knows things, and is thrust in this position where you do have to deal with surveys and pipelines and understanding the law and a lot of these things. So some tribes, if they don't have a TIPO that's dedicated to the job, they get taken advantage of a lot of times by the federal government, especially with the current administration. That's been happening more frequently. But and there are our TIPOs and NAGPRA officers are our first lines of communication with, especially museums. So getting things repatriated. And you have to have some of that knowledge, right, in order to understand what's going on and what materials are ours. I mean, I've been in rooms with it's really fun. I mean, my friends do Southwest archaeology. I don't, but like being in a room with Navajos and Pueblos to talk about what goes where and who owns what, it's a fun time from an outside perspective. And so their TIPOs are usually, it gets pretty fun. Those conversations get interesting.
Yeah, and a TIPO is really important. I've worked on the other side, so I've worked in a museum before where it was sort of my job working with the Nagpura director of that museum to reach out to different tribal communities, which is sort of their first thing that they're supposed to do. And it's really difficult when they reach out to a community that doesn't have a TIPO, because they're like, I'm not sure exactly who do I then contact. Do I contact the tribal president? Do I contact the, the tribal secretary's office? Like, who do I contact? But having that TIPO there, someone who has that background and the knowledge about material culture, and then that institution can sort of talk to them directly and try to start that repatriation process. So TIPOs are really, really important part of that tribal community and government.
I have another kind of an esoteric question, and that is the Echohawk family. We have had these meetings now through the summer, and we spend a lot of time talking about gender issues and the role of women in the Pawnee world. We've really dwelt on that a lot, especially given what Deb and Ronnie do with the Pawnee Seed Preservation Project and how that aligns with Pawnee traditional culture and all that. In indigenous archaeology, do you get a sense that there is a substantial presence of women in the field, and also people of different genders? And so what is your analysis, what's your assessment of the diversity in indigenous archaeology along these lines?
There's a lot of women in this new generation of indigenous archaeologists, which makes me really happy to see women sort of taking on that role. It's, women is the focus of my dissertation research. I think for Native women, reclaiming our traditional spiritual roles is really, really important. And it's part of the reason that I am interested in the ceremony I'm interested in, is because I had a role as a woman in that ceremony that was not written down in any ethnographies or archival material. And so I'm interested in how did our women ancestors in the past be part of this ceremony? Because that's not something that male anthropologists in the 1800s were interested in. So I think today having indigenous women be archaeologists is really important, because it lets us, connect the dots and think about our indigenous women ancestors, which is something, that sort of perspective has largely been ignored by male anthropologists and archaeologists. So I think it's great to have all of these indigenous women in archaeology. I'm really thankful to have them with me through this journey, I would say. Not so much different genders, but I do think that there are some people who identify as, queer. And so there are those people in archaeology. Carlton, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, it's mostly women. And that's just kind of how anthropology is now. It's predominantly a women field. And what's interesting, I guess, talking about the role of women, they're looking at female industries, largely tattooing practices by Kay, beading, like even what I do with pottery. That's everything I usually work with that tells me what something is Pawnee was more than likely produced by a woman, right? Like arrowheads, we know that that's a Pawnee thing, but our arrowheads are pretty homogenous from Canada to Southern Plains. Like there's a Plains type of arrowhead that everyone just kind of makes. But what tells me something's Pawnee is something, styles that a Pawnee woman put in a pot. Which is funny. So basically everything that I study that is identified as Pawnee, it's really identifying a Pawnee woman or Pawnee woman industry. My understanding of Pawnee culture is the women used to run things and the men were just actors, and they were told what to do and when to do it. And that even comes down with the bundles, right? The keepers of the bundles were women. And there's a lot of that association. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I would add too that a lot of the art forms that Lakota people have, so traditional quill work, beadwork, painting, that was all done by women. And so it's kind of funny to me that archaeologists have interpreted Lakota rock art as being made by men, when in fact, traditionally, women would have created all the other forms of art. So why wouldn't Lakota women also create rock art? And a lot of the sort of symbolism you see and the sort of abstract geometric rock art, those designs are seen in beadwork and quill work that Lakota women create in the 1800s, 1900s, and even today. So I agree with Carlton. A lot of the material culture that archaeologists look at were made by women, but have been interpreted by men. So they just assume that men created these things when it was in fact women.
I mean, one of a pottery tradition that has survived comes from the Mandan Hidatsa. This is how we know how a lot of these old practices of how they made their pottery. And unlike other tribes like ours, which stopped making pottery once European goods came up, the reason why they kept making pots is the old women said the metal pots make their corn taste weird, and they preferred making them using the old ways. And that's why they continued making pots, is because the grandmothers said, no, it tastes funny if you do it the other way. And then it is preserved. And it's just one of those kind of funny little moments of history that kind of preserved this old practice that otherwise would have been lost. And Mandan Hidatsa style pottery making was very similar to ours. We did different styles, but the process is different. We don't do the crazy Southwest clapboard or corrugated stuff.
Now for the Ecowalk family, I posted on the Ecowalk Facebook page a text that was prepared by my grandmother, Lucille Toots, San Antonio Ecowalk, in which this text, it's mysterious, but she talks about archaeology in there. And it's an encouragement for Indians. And in her case, I think she was working with my father and his siblings to encourage them to complete high school. And so what we're seeing here tonight, we just spent an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes with Carlton Gover. Carlton is a candidate for a PhD. Once he gets his PhD, he's going to get that PhD. He'll be the first Pawnee in archaeology to have a PhD. He'll be the very first. Now, this could have happened generations ago, but it is happening now, and it will continue to happen in the future. And Emily, I'm curious, what can you say about in Sioux country? Are there other PhDs in archaeology?
Not that I know of. I don't really know if there actually is another Lakota archaeologist with a PhD off the top of my head. I do know that there have been a few Lakota anthropologists, so Ella Deloria is pretty famous, and Beatrice Medicine. So, those are sort of my role models, I guess, through this, trying to be an Indian in anthropology, which is a difficult journey. But I don't know if there's another Lakota archaeologist with a PhD.
Well, I was just, Emily and Carlton, this sounds kind of but I hope you guys drink a little bit more because you have some fantastic ideas, and thank you very much for sharing them with us. It's really been inspiring.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Carlton referred to the time a minute ago, and I want to respect that. I'm sure there's some more questions. I know I have one or two. Emily and Carlton, are you good for another question or two? Where are we at with time?
I am. I'm okay with more.
Yeah, we could do more questions.
Carlton, are you aware that the Echo Hawk family is interested in, well, Uncle Brummett, our family art, one of our family artists, we recently acquired some of his art pieces, and we're trying to figure out where they're going to live, and we're hoping to combine what we just acquired with what is already being held in the family and find a home for it. So there's people here on the call that are involved in the museum. I wonder if you could, the Pawnee Nation Museum, I wonder if you could give us some kind of a, well, are you aware of our interest because of Uncle Brummett's artwork? And can whoever's here involved with the museum give us any kind of an update on it?
Yeah, so I'm on the museum board of directors for the Pawnee Nation, and that was discussed. We haven't talked much about accessions in a while. President Echo Hawk has us working on a grant towards the new cultural center, which would be museum, offices, and language classes and everything. We haven't talked about the Brummett Echo Hawk artwork since 2019, I believe, off of the top of my head. I know it's something that the board of directors would like to acquire and keep safe in perpetuity or for however long the accession agreement is, but right now we're focused on trying to get this new cultural center. We got land put aside for it, but it's working on the grant, getting it funded and getting it staffed. And that's, a 2 to 3 year pipeline as of now.
Carlton, I'm on I'm on a museum committee too. Gwen and I and Walter.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of who the other one was, but anyway, I did talk to Matt, and he agreed to hold, if we needed to hold the paintings, and that he also agreed there wouldn't be any problem in setting aside some room in the museum.
Perfect.
Just for those Echo Hawk paintings.
Perfect.
But,
okay.
I think someday we could, because we have the, it's not an outline, but we have, what it's going to look like. And I think if everybody got to see that, they could understand it more, because I didn't really realize it's going to be wonderful if we get it.
Yeah.
Or when we get it, I guess.
Yeah, we're hoping it's a win. Yeah. We had those OSU undergraduates come up with some designs, and we recently found out a cousin of mine who lives in Seattle. He's designed one of Marshall's nephews. He designs cultural centers. He's an architect, and we recently came across him again, so we brought him on board. But yeah, we're really hoping. We just need the funding. We need to hire a staff member to work, a couple to work full time on this whole thing. That's the big one. Right now it's me, Matt, and Maggie Rice, especially working in our free time, trying to do these grants and proposals. And it's like, we all have full-time jobs. So it's on President Echo Hawk's agenda. He's helping us. Walter's been great moving forward the new cultural center. That's been one of his priorities. So I'm super happy to have him in charge.
Do you have any sense of a timeline? I don't have any concept of what kind of timeline we're even talking about.
2 to 5 years. If we get this next grant to hire employees, then we can get it done in 2 years and built. But if we can, it's going to be a 5-year process. We have the land set aside. The nation's already set it aside. We have some preliminary concepts for the architecture. We just got to get them filled out. The undergraduates are not quite architects yet, so there were some issues with some of the structure, and so And that's just kind of where we're at now. It's 2 to 5 years is the best estimate.
Carlton, this is Lucille.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. Chairman Bunkie has reached out to some of us in the family who have raised money and asked us to serve on a fundraising committee to help raise funds for various things for the tribe, including the museum. What is the fund source that you're preparing this current proposal for?
It is an IMLS grant.
Speak English. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like, what is, I don't even know what IMLS stands for. It's like International Museum Library Services, something like that. So it's a museum grant for, I think it's like 200,000, and that's just it can't be put towards building anything. It's just for staffing or projects.
It's for how much? How much?
It's like it's either 100,000 or 200,000, but it'll allow us to hire either 1 or 2 employees for a year at a competitive salary.
Because one member of this new fundraising committee, excuse me, is Kevin Gover.
Oh.
And somebody should reach out to him and his fundraising team and get some help with that grant proposal.
Yeah, I'm talking to Kevin actually next week, so I'll ask him if he knows anything. I don't think the tribe has ever really reached out to him, but that's a great idea. I'll be sure to pass it by him.
Well, I pass him some specifics, like a draft of the proposal.
Okay.
Lean on him to get some of his advancement people in NMAI to, further work on it or whatever condition it's in to move it along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's going to be neat, Lucille, because we're hoping that we'll be able to sit on top and kind of, like visualize what it was like way back when they sat on top of the mud lodges, which I just think that's so great. I can't wait to do that. And then also we're hoping to get Nora Pratt. I wanted her kitchen because it's a typical old Indian kitchen. And Matt said, forget the kitchen, we can move the whole house maybe. So, and it's a typical Indian home. So, things like that.
Good.
This is a little bit of a side question maybe, but in your signature part of your text, Matt, there's some Russian words. And according to my wife, it means new archaeological school.
Yeah. Yeah, it's Ukrainian. Well, no, I guess it is Russian. Yeah, I am a research associate for a Ukrainian-based research team. And the reason why I do that is that Ukraine and Nebraska look strikingly similar, minus the deteriorating Soviet infrastructure. And the way Ukrainians migrated into Ukraine is very similar to how the Pawnees did it. So I have like a European analogy that shows that I kind of use the Ukrainian stuff to kind of help me with what I do. But like looking at these major populations coming out of Greece and interacting with hunter-gatherers in Ukraine along these riverways and adapting agriculture, even like their house forms look similar, but they're like 9,000 years ago. So that's how I got working in Ukraine, was finding a European analogy to work with. And they've been a blast. And yes, that new archaeological school, that's a perfect translation.
Good job. Have you been over there?
Mm-hmm. I was there last summer, and then I was supposed to go back, but then COVID. But I'll be going back next summer. It's the flight's expensive, but like as a PhD student, I lived like a king in that country. The ratio was just fantastic. I was eating like T-bone steaks every night for $2. I was in heaven.
Sounds like you worked for an oligarch over there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are there other questions?
Carlton,
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask you, I've heard throughout this meeting how we really need young people. What do you think the age is that we could get young people interested in this? I I made it a mission for me to take my two grandsons up to Norfolk, Nebraska when we had the Arikara reunion, and my oldest grandson was I think he was 11, and then he had a younger brother, but I specifically made it a point I wanted to take them so that they could see part of their culture. And what was really interesting was, I think the last night, the last day, they performed a pipe ceremony, and the men had to sit down on, the Pawnee men sat on one side, the Arikara men sat on the other side, and I tried to get my grandson to go sit down there, but he was too bashful. And anyway, I went to a gathering the following week in Pawnee when Helen was talking about, I think the subject was, how many service clubs did the Pawnees have? And I mentioned that I wanted to know how many children had gone with us to that reunion. And I think we came up with a number of 13. And so I'm thinking, how can we get a program going that would start piquing the interest of young people? So now my grandson's 12, and he's, as a friend of mine says, you're in middle school mentality. But I try to make sure that if I can get my grandchildren to any of these cultural events, I try to take them, because they are not full-bloods and they don't have a lot of color to them. And so anytime I communicate with them or wish them a greeting or something, I always say, I love my Pawnee grandsons, or I love my Pawnee student, or something. But anyway, I was just wondering, if the people in Pawnee could try to come up with a kind of cultural class that could start trying to pique the interest of our young ones. How young do you think it could possibly start at?
Oh, easily elementary school. I do a lot of public outreach with my local communities here. And when I was up at Wyoming, they have a huge public archaeology festival.
Wow.
And really what I found, especially for younger kids, is like active involvement. So like I do pre-contact pottery, and I'm pretty sure I'm the only Pawnee potter. There might be like 2 or 3, and I've been wanting to come down to Pawnee and teach people like what I know to show and to try to bring a revitalization of that, because some of our pots are just super awesome. And or like young boys love these atlatls. So it acts as a second elbow. There's a giant, it's like a 6-foot arrow you put at the end of this, and you can toss these things 100 yards, and you put a fake bison at the end of a field, and you tell Pawnee kids, like, these little darts, we came over, this is what we had before bows and arrows, and you can take down a mammoth with these things.
Wow.
And they'll spend the entire day working on them. And then also getting to make arrowheads out of stone. I do that too. And that's why I teach kids. And it's like, really, if you actively engage with them in some of these practices that we no longer do, that sparks their interest, especially at a young age. And then like really getting more in depth. I've had a lot of success with getting high school kids interested, and it's usually kids that aren't doing very well. Like I had a 2.33 GPA in high school because nothing interested me, right? Because archaeology isn't something taught. So I've had success with kids that are they just don't like anything. They can't find anything interesting, but you show them like archaeology and they're like, oh, so this is a blending of history, science, and all this cool stuff in physics, and you can apply it. That's where I found the most success, is like hands-on activities and just introducing something new, and like just treating them like, because I can take a kid out, a couple of them on my mom's side, my European side, I've brought my nephews out from Utah to a site to come work with me.
Mhm.
And it's got them interested. And I can do that with Pawnee kids, even at Lynch.
Wow.
If I just maybe need a day to talk to them about the do's and don'ts of archaeology, like don't stab yourself with a trowel and don't pick things out of the ground before we map it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's a
Wow.
hands-on experience. Like the lecturing, I enjoy talking, as I imagine you guys have guessed so far, but it's really it's the doing part that gets people interested in, and especially like maybe not in a class, but doing. I know archaeology. October is Oklahoma Archaeology Month, and the universities are doing a bunch of activities, and then maybe in the future I could, or someone can host a weekend in Pawnee at the one of the local ball fields and set up a bunch of activities that introduce part of our history that we might not remember anymore.
I had that idea a few years back when one of our cousins was president of the Pawnee Indian Veterans Organization, our cousin Earl. And I used to think, how could we get our young people, and I'm talking young, how could we get them involved with something cultural instead of, when a powwow's over and the dancing's done, the old folks go back to the camp and the young people run off down to the country road where they're having the local 49. And my parents would never let me do that. I always had to stay in camp, and I didn't like it then, but I'm appreciative of it now. But I was thinking if I could talk to Earl, what were the things that we could do? Just something that we could get them interested in their culture. And instead of going to 49s, why don't we have teaching them archery or teaching them to care for a horse? After you get done with the powwow at night, they're still energized from running around doing this and that and whatever. So I was trying to think of ways that we could change that direction of just hanging out and socializing and drinking to changing it to cultural, educational fun. But I never got that conversation because we lost him to cancer. And so I really like the idea. That's almost making me excited to move back to Pawnee if we could get that direction going, really.
Yeah. That's been a huge side project of mine is recreating some of this ancient technology. So I think I have like 6 or 7 Osage orange bow staves downstairs that I'm working on in different Pawnee styles and plain styles, and making traditional arrows, atlatl darts, atlatls. I have an old hide shield. If you see, as Emily knows, some of the old rock art, the ancient plains warfare used to be like 300 giant hide shields and lances, and line up and make shield walls and shoot arrows at each other and charge each other. Wow. I'm making one of those. That took a lot of bison. I had to pay a fair amount to get that thing going. And that's something I want to share with the tribe, because I know I'm not doing it totally right. And I know there's families that probably have stories about it, or other people that do it. And it'd just be great to kind of bring that stuff back. And like you said, like after the powwow, if there's other cultural stuff, like have kids shoot traditional Pawnee bows, throw atlatls, or make stone points, or make pots, or that's the fun stuff. That's the hands-on things, right? The Pawnee culture isn't just dancing and singing. There's a whole material element to it. Right. And it works with the language too. Like the word for flint, lightning, and fire is the same word. And that's a cultural connection between those three things that, and Europeans don't associate those as the same, but our ancestors did. The language does, and we're being reminded of those things. I think is extremely important, and then especially for concepts of identity.
I also, in the conversation a while back in this evening, you talked about, some people had mentioned about how when we go back to these places, there's some specialness about it. There's a feeling. I personally think it's a spiritual thing, just like working with the seeds. To me, there's a spiritual feeling if people will commit to the work. And it's not hard work, but it's a lot of work. And, you know, I always try to help my cousin Debbie because she's got a lot of work working with the corn and the seeds. But one of the other things I'm truly blessed and thankful for is that I took my 2 grandsons up to Nebraska 2 years ago when we harvested, I think it was 7 acres of corn. And I even took a couple of friends with them, and they were just blown away by the experience. And so one of these days I'm going to sit my grandsons down and say, hey, do you remember that year we went up to pick corn, and this is blue corn, and it's corn from our people. So I think that's something that we as adults need to do about, if we can get our children and our grandchildren to experience cultural things, then we need to go back and refresh their memory and kind of tie in that experience to the significance of how important it is to identify that as who they are and identify it with our ancestors. I heard a presentation at WashU by a lady named Katie who grew up in Alaska, but she was Choctaw, and she gave the presentation about this experience of her and some other people who took a group of women who walked the Trail of Tears that the Choctaws did. And believe me, they felt something when they were on that. So when we were up in Nebraska at that Arikara reunion, I was really humbled that, you know, we had Ponca people talking about these sacred sites of the Pawnees, you know, because like you said, not only are we talking about sites of our ancestors, but we need to be sharing and experiencing modern day with other tribes because they're in that location, you know. Yeah, I'm really glad that you gave us a lot of things to think about, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you.
So is there any last question, anyone?
What's the date again on when he's going to be in Pawnee?
December 15th. I'll be there that week. That's the plan, and I'm glad I get to talk to you guys, because if I can meet up with Deb and others, that'd be fantastic. Because I only need to be there for the 15th, but I'd like to stay for the week and hang out and talk with more people.
Is that in front of the date or after the date?
Let me see. I haven't made the plans yet, but I should be there for at least Monday to Thursday. Okay. So the 14th through the 17th should be open.
Helen, do you hear that? Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is Ronnie. I don't have any questions, but I just want to let both of you know how impressed I am and how inspired I am by people your age, younger, doing this. Emily, your tribe is huge, and you're the only one you know of doing this. That is just, as a female, I just want to cheer for you. It's so inspiring that you're doing what you are. And it's huge that you're doing what you are. It's so important, both of you. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You.
So, well, I think I'll go ahead and wrap this up. Interrupt me if you still have another question, anybody. I really appreciate what you've done for the family tonight, making this recording, taking the time to share all this stuff and give us a moment to reflect on some really important issues. I think there's some very meaningful things that have been discussed here tonight. So thank you both for doing that for our family. Last week, Lucille shared her story, and I've been working here and there to get the recording ready to upload. I don't quite have that done. I've got a little more time left of tinkering to get it up there, but I will. And I will do the same for this. It might take a week or more, but I'll send you a link to how it turns out. So again, I really thank you. You've given us a lot to sit with and think about, and much appreciated, both of you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us and asking us to speak here. And, you know, thank you, Roger, for the invitation.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Carlton said. I'm really honored to have, you know, been here with you guys tonight. It was a really, really great talk. And I think I have some things to think about too. It's always good to, you know, it's just Carlton and I sometimes chatting about it, but it's good to talk to other Indian folks about archaeology, and especially you guys, you all. So yeah, thank you so much. It was a real treat to sit and chat with all of you tonight. So thanks.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You.
Well, and if you have further thoughts and developments, we'd love to have you back again.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Lance,
Well,
can you spend a few minutes talking about family business?
Yeah, Roger, did you have something you want to do? And we'll stick around after this and take care of some business, Lucille.
Well, I want to take care of it before Helen leaves.
Okay.
I just wanted to thank everybody for joining in tonight and sharing with us the time we've spent thinking about all of these issues. There's hopefully this is the kind of conversation that's happening nationwide as people are doing things online of this nature. And so I'm really delighted that everybody came on board tonight to hear the discussion. So thanks to everybody.
Thank you for that, Roger.
Glad to be here.